Welcome to Plato's Cave. I'm Jordan Myers, and I'm a master's student in philosophy at the University of Houston. You're listening to a reading group episode of the show, which means that in this episode I discuss political philosophy with two non-philosopher friends, Adam and Giffin, because philosophy shouldn't just be for philosophers. So, with that introduction, please enjoy our discussion of political philosophy. Just a quick note before we get to the episode. This was one of those recordings that was done many years ago, and in fact, if you're watching on YouTube, it's so long ago you'll see that I had a full head of hair. So that will give you an idea just of how long ago this was. This was back before Plato's Cave really kind of got started. So, with that introduction and additional information, please enjoy this episode. So, Giffin, you've prepared a comparison between the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Declaration of Independence, and also the Bill of Rights. So, we're going to be
also the Constitution.
Yes, and
not
also
just
the
Bill of Rights.
Constitution. So we're going to be talking about those four documents and the philosophy behind them and their authors and basically everything in that realm. So, okay, so what were your thoughts on like how we would go about actually doing the comparison?
Yeah, so I guess we could just discuss the authors would be the primary thing we would want to lay down first. I can just do that now. So the Declaration of Independence was largely crafted by Thomas Jefferson, as I'm sure you guys know. And what you may not know, and the audience may not know, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which is a French document, it was drafted primarily by a Frenchman by the name of Abbé Sieyès, and I butchered that pronunciation, I'm sure. I'm not French. And the Marquis de Lafayette, which you shall remember from American history.
You shall remember it.
You shall remember it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I should say for our international listeners, don't turn off the episode because I think like while this is kind of in an American context, I think the philosophies behind both documents are very generalizable.
Yeah.
But sorry, continue, Giffin.
Yeah, but so what's interesting though is that the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which is, again, a kind of a foundational document of the French Revolution and had influences throughout Europe, really. This was drafted in consultation with Thomas Jefferson, the Marquis de Lafayette. Of course, you'll remember from American history. So I actually had contact with Jefferson while this was being drafted. So the fact that Thomas Jefferson kind of played a role in foundational documents in American history and European history is kind of my inspiration for the comparison.
Yeah, actually, do you have the dates of like there being both documents being drafted, being published, just to kind of like contextualize all of this?
Yeah, so the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, what we're talking about here is 1789, and as far as I'm aware, it was drafted within 1789 and also presented in that year, but there might have been a little bit before, but it was definitely drafted within 1789. And this is a year that you should remember being the start of the French Revolution, and generally speaking.
Okay, interesting. So how did you want to go about like actually like do you want to systematically move through all of the 17 different rights, or do you want to kind of hopscotch around? Like, what do you think?
I definitely wanted to hopscotch around. I want this to be a little bit more natural. I imagined I would bring up some like points, get some discussion, and then, I'll bring up some, comparisons. We can have a little bit of discussion on that. Not in a, point by point. There are definitely some more minor enumerated rights in the Declaration of the Rights of Man that we don't really need to discuss.
Yeah.
So
do you know, this is kind of getting into like the minute history of it, I guess, but so was this document published like officially before the revolution? Was it kind of like during the stirrings of the French Revolution?
So that will depend entirely on when you actually define the French Revolution. But this is a
Okay.
foundational document. So this is before the Reign of Terror, much before that was. We're talking about like 92, 93 for that. So this is. Some people would probably call this the beginning. I imagine the beginning of the French Revolution really being whenever the Estates General needed to be called in the first place. This is after the king was informed that France was out of money, basically, in no small part because of the tax scheme that has ruled France, for centuries now. And I wanted to talk about that. I imagine that would be a good, interesting point of conversation. But also, it was influenced by the American Revolution. France financed and played a large role in the American Revolution, and for which the crown paid.
Mm-hmm.
Literally, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, because I was just curious about that. So what were you saying about the tax system?
Yeah, so so basically the tax scheme, and this is something that you see throughout kind of feudal Europe. It was one where the lower classes bared the brunt of the tax burden. So in France, so we talk about progressive tax schemes, which is the standard scheme of the modern world, right? Where the wealthier you are, the more you pay in taxes. In France, it was actually regressive in that the lower classes paid taxes, and then the upper classes, the nobility specifically, had exemptions from taxes.
Seems familiar.
No, but that's kind of one of the motivating forces for a revolutionary change in a lot of Europe.
Mm-hmm.
There was a guy from our high school that argued for a regressive tax system senior year.
To go back to the good old days.
Good old days.
The good old days of the feudal landlords.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We never even mentioned that. Like, we all went to high school together, the three of us.
No.
A very diverse group we have here.
Yeah. we're so much the same that we can't even represent different school districts.
Yep. Same elementary schools.
So is it contentious to say that I mean, maybe this depends on your current day politics, but is it contentious to say that the regressive tax system was a direct cause, or at least one of the direct causes to the revolution?
I can't say it is the direct cause, but it is definitely a direct influence.
Mm-hmm. I was just asking because I could see, I don't know, like Ben Shapiro just chirping that like a regressive tax was actually helpful somehow because of trickle down economics, or he would fabricate some sort of a response, and I was just curious, like, how is there historical debate actually that was like a leading cause to the revolution, or no?
Quite frankly, I don't know of any such debate. I think it's pretty sound reasoning that the tax structure played a role in the French Revolution. I don't think that would be... I'm sure you could find someone who's making the regressive tax scheme this was like the peak of human civilization, but I've never heard such an argument.
I can't remember. Oh, go ahead, Adam.
I was gonna say the third estate was the peasantry class, right? And
no. So I'll that's a good thing to bring up, is because one of the things that kind of started the French Revolution was the calling of the Estates General. I mentioned that earlier, and there were three estates that embody basically the nation of France. It was the clergy, the nobility, and then the third estate,
which made up just everyone else.
Was everyone else. It wasn't just the peasantry. It was also business people, anyone involved in like commerce, merchants, lawyers, all of these people. So well-off professionals are also in this group, and you'll see that that's a very driving motivational force.
And they were still being taxed. So was it just the third estate that was being taxed?
So it was not just the third estate being taxed, but there were, like I mentioned, certain exemptions that the nobility specifically had. And I will not pretend to be an expert on the tax structure of pre-revolutionary France, but I can tell you that the third estate had tax burden that was, higher. It was a regressive tax scheme.
What about the clergy?
I frankly don't know much about the clergy, quite frankly.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like
it was
I feel
important
like,
enough to be its own class.
I feel like they could have weaseled themselves a few exemptions.
I'm sure that's the way God wanted it.
Yeah, the clergy played. I wish I could say I knew more about the clergy's role, but in reality, the French Revolution became very secular in nature.
Mm-hmm.
It was only in conservative reactions where you saw the clergy trying to claw back some influence.
Mm.
So I think that nicely sets up the context for this document.
Yeah.
So the question I have first is, so there's obviously like 1 through 17 of these, but when they were published, were there actual like numerated 1 through 17 articles?
I believe yes.
Yeah, okay.
The document itself had like a preamble or like pretext,
Mhm.
and then there were articles that were specifically enumerated. I think it would probably use Roman numerals. It was like Article 1, and then of course it was French, and then it laid out Article 1, and then it was Article 2 all the way down to 17.
Okay, because I didn't know if I was kind of imagining some sort of a ranking or importance, or if it was purposefully laid out like that. Do you know?
The physical laying out of the document, I could not say.
Okay.
You'd have to consult the Marquis de Lafayette
Okay, because I was just curious
or
if
Jefferson.
if for some reason 1 was like the most important and 17 was the least important.
No, I imagine this probably came about through like discussion, conversation, debate. The first thing, that people decided, or the drafters of the, the Declaration said,
Yeah.
maybe if there was some like strong agreement about, that might have made its way first, and then later ones were added. I really can't say. I'm not sure it's terrible.
So probably just there's a correlation in the sense that the more important ones will enter the conversation before maybe less important ones, but there's no guarantee that that's the case. So,
Yeah, that's exactly what my line of thinking was.
And the interesting thing is that like included in the title, they're declaring the rights of the man and the citizen. So rights do kind of, just like by their nature, tend to kind of be on an even playing field. Like no right, rights do supersede other rights, but it does sort of have like an elevated.
No, I think you're right.
Do you know what I mean?
So we're getting at natural rights here. So these are things that are, well, so I guess I should mention some of the inspiration for the document. It's really an expression of Enlightenment thinking, and then the common influence beyond just general Enlightenment thinking is going to be Rousseau, and specifically his concept of the general will. And there's a little bit of debate as to how much Rousseau himself would have agreed with both his use, like the drafters of the Declaration's use of the word, like the phrase general will, as it pertains to like the Declaration itself, and also some debate about like what his thoughts on the consequences it had for like the French Revolution and the French governments. But those are the primary influences, and in that is the idea of the natural right, and you see this in American, revolutionary documents as well. Yeah, these are kind of supposed to live on a higher tier than like right through like law.
Yeah, and I guess they almost seem to be on a higher tier, but then equal within that tier. Do you know what I mean?
In theory, maybe. Yeah, I get what you're getting at. Like they can't be ranked within this category of the rights. Now, I'm sure that individual like drafters and the important players of the French Revolution probably had some preferences, but from a moralistic standpoint, these are supposed to be rights that are enshrined.
But even that kind of depends. When reading through it, there are a lot of caveats involved in many of the rights given. So it's like, yes, they are rights and they are above the law, yet a lot of these do take into account that laws can directly enter this sort of framework of rights. So,
which is weird, right? Because this is supposed to be framing the laws. I kind of took it to mean, right?
So this is where we get one of the major differences between like the American documents and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. There's a lot of similarities to be drawn. Like I said, Jefferson was involved in both personally, but you will notice if you go through the list of the articles in the Declaration of the Rights of Man, that a lot of them introduce the caveat, like, you know, this right is enshrined for all people, you know, for all men and citizens, except in the case that law restricts it, unless in the case that it, you know, betrays the general will, things like that. Those caveats are huge because the Declaration, like the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, don't really introduce these clauses. And that's one of the things I thought we could talk about a lot because the way
can we dive into 4 right now? Like
Absolutely.
Article 4? I think that one best sort of exemplifies what we're talking about. It says, Article 4 says, liberty consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one else. Hence, the exercise of the natural rights of each man has no limits, except those which assure to the other members of the society the enjoyments of the same rights. These limits can only be determined by law. So it's like, okay, yeah, you can pretty much do whatever you want as long as you're not harming anyone else. And what determines whether you're harming anyone else? Well, the law, right? So
you're absolutely right.
Yeah,
so how are 4 and 5 different? Because 5 says law can only prohibit such actions as are hurtful to society. Nothing may be prevented which is not forbidden by law, and no one may be forced. I guess it maybe just expands on it.
I guess I could imagine a situation in which a law could restrict an action that is helpful to society, which happens to injure someone else in some sort of strange way.
Like,
that makes sense?
Like maybe killing infants that have like a brain malady?
I'm not willing to say.
Or just like as an example. Like maybe something like that.
Possibly. So liberty consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one else. So it's difficult to say. They're related. There's probably some like theoretical overlap there. But again, the caveat of the law being instituted into this is incredibly interesting.
Well, actually I think the difference, I don't know, the fourth right seems to be almost more focused on like the practicality of things, and then 5 seems to be more focused on harms or like hurts to you know, hurtfulness to people. Because like 4 kind of says like, well, you know, the exercise of each right has no limits except those which assure that other members have the same rights. So like, you know, it almost kind of sets a ceiling to some rights in some categories. But the other one, the 5th article, seems to be more concerned about preventative harms, like it's a positive versus a negative freedom, right? Like 4 is trying to maximize your positive freedoms that you have, and 5 is telling you which negative freedoms are restricted.
Yeah, so 4 seems to describe liberty and its relation to the law, and then 5 describes the context of law, like the breadth of law.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I that's okay. That actually answers my question because I wrote on my little page, I said, how are these different? 4 and 5. So what is 4? Do you guys take 4 to be talking about something like a victimless crime? Because I wasn't sure where that fell in the bounds of this these rights, but maybe specifically between 4 and 5.
Yeah, I kind of read the same thing as you. That 4 does speak to a victimless crime. Like when I was reading it, I was like, okay, this would be very interesting in the context of drug laws, right?
I wrote that on my paper, yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. But then when I read 5, it said law can only prohibit such actions as are harmful to society. I was like, well, there you go with some ambiguity again. It comes down to, although it doesn't directly injure someone else, this could be, just deleterious for society in general. Therefore, it's worthy to, outlaw it or criminalize it in some sort of way. So,
and it seems like it's already kind of, you're seeing the tension of weighing rights, like the right to alter your own consciousness versus the right to, I guess, like have a functioning society. Right.
Yeah,
not
actually
not
something
that
I
taking,
wanted to discuss.
Yeah. Not that taking drugs just destroys society instantly, but you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean. But this is something that's actually very interesting, the way that France and the United States, well, really it's the United States and other European countries have developed, because you do see a lot of contradiction in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, but also you see like exemptions that seem intuitive to me. So that might have implications in terms of the ability of like Congress to affect society positively.
Mm-hmm. What's an example of that?
Yeah, so the Bill of Rights enshrines
the
rights.
First one, yeah.
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 They describe rights, but they don't introduce any caveats. So that introduces an interesting kind of paradigm, because you've seen this in the United States history a lot. There's huge, anytime there's any idea of an infringement of right, it is an enormous issue. I mean, well, it was only like in this century, really, like almost a decade ago, a little over a decade ago, where the right to personally own firearms was affirmed in the Supreme Court. But this was kind of, do you see what I'm getting at?
Kind of, yeah. The one, actually, I kind of wanted to wait to get to this, but it seems too relevant right now.
Yeah.
I noticed, like, there were several themes I noticed between the two documents, but one of them was like highlighted and exemplified in the first, like the comparison of the first right, was the Declaration of Independence. The document has much more of a religious tone to it, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man has much more of a secular tone to it. So, like, even in the first, like in the Declaration of Independence, it says, all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. So they even reference, like, these rights are grounded in the fact that they came from a creator. So it seems to be an exceptionless sort of like a not necessarily supernatural, but sort of super secular way of looking at it. And in the Declaration of Rights of Man, they say, all men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be founded upon only the general good. So there's just like a huge difference in tone that I sensed, even from the first one on.
I think what you're sensing is the American founders, they had a propensity towards deism, which is reflected in the documents. Whereas, again, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, the French Revolution took very secular, had very secular influences almost throughout.
And just sort of circling back around to what we were just talking about like a few seconds ago, but I mean, as a result of these two trends, you see that, the Bill of Rights seems to lack a little nuance that the Declaration of Rights of, man and citizens seems to have. Yet at the same time, like when you read some of these articles, you can see the danger in the nuance, though. You know what I mean? That I mean, it's very dangerous how these seemingly, like you said, Giffin, intuitive caveats can become very dangerous. Like, I just want to repeat again, law can only prohibit such actions as are hurtful to society. What? I mean, who determines that? Who determines which actions are hurtful to society?
Adam, you're getting at something very good.
And also, like, honestly, I don't want to sound like a Republican, but one of the things that makes America great is the fact that there are some freedoms that we have that actually do harm society, but we still have those freedoms, right? Like, if we wanted to, like you really do have the right to do a lot of things that are deleterious to society. Like, we could make the speed limit 5 miles an hour, and no one would ever die from a like a highway accident ever again. But we don't do that. So, but if we were reading the Declaration of Rights of Man literally, it seems like that's well within the law's capacity to do.
You're absolutely right. So what I kind of imagine when reading these two and seeing the comparisons is you're right. The nuance does seem a little bit dangerous, and it does not go kind of beyond me that the United States has basically stayed relatively together since the Constitution. Really, we had a civil war, of course, but there's an argument that we're on our first republic, or well, second if you count the Articles of Confederation, but France is on like what, their fifth or sixth republic, and I think that is because the American documents, they do enshrine higher the liberties, often at the expense of societal progress. But the upside of that is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and their caveats are dangerous, because if you have an executive branch or a dictatorship in which they define harmful to society super broadly, well, you can kind of invoke the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in terrifying ways.
So the argument is that explains why we're still on the first iteration of our republic? That's interesting.
I don't know that it explains it wholesale, but sure. I think it definitely is a moderating force, or not necessarily even moderating, but a force that pulls away from radicalization.
Well, this is like, that actually plays into something I wanted to ask you guys about too, because I think this kind of gets to the quintessence of the deep, I guess, like distinction in values that people have between who is responsible for societal upkeep. Is it like the culture itself, or is it the government? So like this is, I don't know why like Ben Shapiro's coming to mind again, but I've heard him say like he just to put it out there as an argument, like he's said that the like the reason why taxes should be low is because help should be kind of neighbor to neighbor, and it should be voluntary, and it should be based in a religious context. That seems much more akin to the Declaration of Independence, where someone who is more secular and progressive, I think David Packman pushed back against this and said, well, no, like that was fine in a more antiquated time, but now we need a larger, more secular, more governmental institution to take care of its citizens. So I thought that like the fourth and the fifth articles here like really got to the core of that debate.
Yeah, and just to kind of comment on that, at least for my view of American history, I see that with societal progress, there has been a wave of thought outside the purview of the government. But once that wave becomes big enough, then those sentiments are enshrined in the culture by the government, right? I mean, we see that with slavery. We see that with things like, even things like prohibition. What about...
Wait, sorry. Do you mean enshrined in the government by the culture, or enshrined in the culture by the government?
So, well, I'm saying that, there is a big enough wave in the culture that to sort of impose these cultural values on everyone,
okay,
the government then enshrines it in the culture.
So it trickles up to the government, and the government then spreads it over the whole culture.
Yeah,
sure.
Adam.
Okay.
Yeah, that's been my view of history. I think pretty much any cultural movement, I would argue, maybe you could find an exception, but I would say that they've pretty much all followed that trend. It's not like the government from day one was like, okay, here are the values we're going to push upon everyone. It was more like a majority of people came to these values, but there was still a minority of people that didn't share them. But then the government was like, okay, now we're all going to collectively share these values. That's how I've seen it. But
yeah, so I think where you're getting at is the something that I didn't touch upon prior, but that the Constitution, is amendable, and that is a way. And again, that's a hefty requirement for the culture to get to that point, right?
Sure.
And there's an argument that it is less responsive to the needs of the people, But at the same time, once the force gets big enough, we have the capacity to amend it. I hesitate to say easily. We haven't done it in a while.
But it's a little easier than you think, though, because we don't actually have to amend the Constitution directly. Because, I mean, think about civil rights, right? All you have to do is reinterpret the Constitution in such a way that you could, no, but I'm saying that that is a path that is enshrined in the United States government. So, right? I mean,
No, it is.
How about Brown v. Board of Education, 1950s? Was it 54? I mean, it was that was just a reinterpretation of the Constitution.
So, Adam, so the kind of perspective that I'm gonna prod you with is that
Get ready for your product.
Is it possible that that these kind of like governmental, like executive or legislative manifestations of these societal agreements is a betrayal of the Constitution, and we should be going through the Constitution to make these things, acceptable, but rather we have accepted as a society in a little bit of a betrayal of the Constitution that these other avenues, through the judicial, kind of interpretation and through legislative action can kind of get some of the responsiveness to the people that the Constitution is just a little bit too rigid for.
Well, I mean, I don't want to, prevaricate like a politician here, but I will say that, many of the founding fathers were men of the Enlightenment. They were men of the American Enlightenment, and I think that many of them, given how much culture has progressed, would find it acceptable to operate in a way to reinterpret the Constitution in such a way to allow for cultural progress. That would be my argument. So I'm trying to play devil's advocate here a bit. Sure.
I mean, I'm kind of in a general agreement with the sentiment at least, but I think there's a good argument that like the flexibility that you're just talking about is rather through reinterpretation, could be through amendment, like textual amendment.
Yeah. And the thing is, textual amendment, I guess if I were to counter that, then I would be betraying the essence of the Constitution but I will make a maybe not so bold statement and say that it is too slow. It is too slow. We've discovered in 200 years of this country that it's just too slow. I mean, if we were going to solve everything by literally amending the Constitution, we wouldn't have gotten civil rights.
Adam, you're exactly right. And that's exactly one of the things I wanted to bring up between the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Like the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence enshrine ideas and are the foundation of government, but they are inherently more rigid than, this other very important piece of like Western thought.
Sure. And the thing is, I'm not going to gripe about the fact that we have such a rigid Constitution, because there is a subset of the population, including me, that is happy to have a rigid Constitution and yet, interpret it in a flexible way. so I will bathe in that hypocrisy. So
I almost wonder if that, by not going through the avenues of it though, does it degrade its power over time? Because I guess I don't understand. I guess it is Giffin's question a bit, almost entirely. But I guess can you explain to me again, why, if we kind of circumnavigate it, almost we just we're looping around and around, and each time we pass it again, we kind of reinterpret it a bit more. Is it what's the saying about a tree? If it bends, it won't break, but if it's too rigid, then it will. Is it that sort of a thing?
Yeah, but keep in mind though that even when reinterpreting the Constitution is still the basis for whatever changes in law or rights people will have, right? I mean, it's not like you can't reinterpret the Constitution to mean exactly the opposite of what it's saying.
Yes.
I don't think what would be a good example of the exact opposite, or something maybe outside the spirit of the Constitution?
Okay, right? So I'll recognize that there's probably a subset of like the population in America that think that 90% of government is outside the bounds of the Constitution. Recognizing that, though, I don't think any of us are part of that group. I will give you an example, possibly.
Sure. Go for it.
So, do you all agree that equality is one of the kind of enshrined principles of the American documents?
Yeah, for white males, yeah.
Well, the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment. So, yes.
Yeah.
So
I will extend this. I will extend this, to include, all of the amendments. But I think I would argue that, like, the fact, all men are created equal, that wasn't the 14th Amendment. So I would argue it was enshrined earlier, but you're correct. So we all agree.
Well, the 14th Amendment was just a little more explicit about it, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Just I think it was just all meant.
It was basically stating for everyone that there was a huge, kind of hypocrisy going on prior. You can state the values and then, go to your field hands.
Find them later, yeah.
Yeah,
sure.
But so this is my argument, and this is a comparison that I kind of wanted to bring up. I wanted to see your thoughts on it. Positive discrimination. So, how this is something that you could argue pretty easily, actually.
You mean affirmative action?
Yeah, affirmative action. So, thank you for reframing that.
Yeah.
But positive discrimination, affirmative action, there's very good arguments, and I'm sympathetic to them a little bit, in fact, that's outside the bounds of the Constitution. And to make this a little bit more interesting and tie it to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, affirmative action and positive discrimination like that is not a thing in France. It is explicit. It's because of the interpretation of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. It is considered to betray the sense of equality that's enshrined.
Do you know? I want to know specifically, like where is France pulling from to say that is not allowed? Like which right specifically? Do you know?
It's a good question, actually. Article 1 says men are born and remain free and equal in rights. But there's little drips and drops of that kind of sentiment throughout the document. But I
would want to know which one specifically. I just sorry, that is a really hard thing to just look up on the spot.
There's 17 of these things, and I don't have them memorized. But
no, I know.
Article 1 is the one that stands out to me. That's the one I do know.
Because it's just like I don't know. It could also just not be explicit. Like the government could have said, based on Article 10, whatever it is, that like this is why we're not going to allow it, or they could have just referenced the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in general.
I do think Article 1 is probably what they would point to. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights, and that is a pretty broad statement. And I find it interesting that we have been kind of assuming to this point that the Constitution and the American documents are almost at a higher tier, broader in scope in their rights.
They seem to be more rigid. Yeah.
Say that again?
Well, they seem to be more rigid. I don't know about broader.
Well, they don't have exceptions in the same way.
They're uncompromising. But I don't know if that's broader per se.
Okay, this is just semantics, but okay, I think
I know
the sentiment.
Yes. Sorry. Well, I just wanted to make sure we did.
I just found it interesting that we kind of, in general, assume the American documents are less compromising, and yet at the same time we have, as a society, kind of allowed affirmative action to have a place, in that.
But do you think that goes, like you were saying, outside the Constitution?
He is saying
there's a strong argument for it, because it is a system in which you have a group of people by birth have an inherent advantage.
Yeah.
I would have to read the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action to comment. However, I can't think of a good reason why it would be constitutional as the layman that I am. You know what I mean? So, right?
Right. This is an incredibly nuanced discussion, and it's really responding to societal difficulties that France didn't see, in the same way. There's a lot of different forces, and I can almost bring up here another point that I kind of planned on mentioning, is that there's a good argument for a sense of American exceptionalism So what are your thoughts on American exceptionalism?
Would define that for the audience.
I mean, different people are going to define it differently, but it's the sense
U.S.
that
number one.
Yeah. So for some people, it's that the United States can and never will and never has done any wrong. But for other people, it's just that the United States is very unique in the world.
Sure. And that we shouldn't. There's no reason necessarily to model our system of life or government after any other society because we are just unique. And
yes,
there is something inherently good about our society.
Well, that's ridiculous.
There is that has been brought up many times. Whenever ideas are brought up, especially pulled from other nations, even like Western nations, that it can't work because the United States is too unique. And I would make a good argument that, especially, how do I phrase this? There is a good argument for American exceptionalism, but it doesn't come down to some dogmatic, religious approval of the United States. But it does come down to the circumstances under which the nation was founded. Because what we have in the United States and what we have in France, to make the direct comparison, are completely different. There is the model for giving rights to people and the model of government for the United States there was no peasantry class in the United States at its founding. There was no rural, there was no poor in the same way that we saw it in France at the same time, right? I'm saying right, but
yeah. Well, it depends what you mean by poor, right? I mean, I wouldn't say there was any poor class, but I would say that there was already, great income inequality between those who were crafting the Constitution and just the average, and the average person who resided in, the average constituent in these states. So, yeah, I wouldn't say poor though. I mean,
So the founding of the country is heavily rooted in merchants. You have a merchant class and a surrounding lawyer class, and that is a huge this is a huge body compared to the France where you have just enormous millions of people that are just urban poor. And before industrialization, they're just poor. They eat bread, and if they can't get bread, they die. There's a nobility that, while you could argue that some places in the South, especially like Virginia,
the FFVs
kind of have the first families of Virginia. You can argue that they kind of have an aura of the nobility, but at the same time, it's not quite to this extreme as it was in France, where they had specific noble rights and tax exemptions, and there were people who were the land workers for the nobles, who were one of the rules that was a thing at this point. One of the feudal dues was at least a certain number of days of free labor was owed to the nobles a year. So this is a system that was not in place in the United States. Of course, there's the slavery, but it's new. It's very different.
Well, I'm not talking about slavery necessarily. I'm talking about there were already well-established families in the United States that intended to construct a government that would serve their interests, and to be fair, serve the interests of the constituents in their individual states, right?
Absolutely.
So, but I want you to make your point though. This was the
what's
premise
there for? Yeah.
You were saying there's something unique about our founding.
So what I was getting at was, it is something important. The American exceptionalism, there's a good argument here, specifically as it relates to how the United States can or cannot serve as a model for other nations and other peoples to gain rights. So in Europe, you have basically anywhere in Central or Eastern Europe, you have people that, were behind even England and France at the time. And it is difficult for me to imagine that these people would be able to look towards the founding of the United States as a model for themselves, either for the people, the poor, the relative third estate, the businessmen, because I don't think the United States didn't serve as a good model, and I don't think it really served as a good model for anywhere, not even other nations in the West, in the New World.
Do you
Well,
Does that
hence,
come-
oh, no, go
Yeah,
ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to ask, like, so does that difference, is it hinged on something in like the zeitgeist, or was it more? Is it something physical? Like, is it actually like the physical form that our like the people of the American Revolution had, or like is it the geographical? Like, what is that difference that you're saying?
So to get it, I can't say I know for sure. The absolute essence.
What's your suggestion? Yeah.
But so what I would suggest.
What was
is
the question? Just once again.
I was asking Giffin, like, so Giffin said that he didn't think that the American Revolution could serve as a good model or a good example to have other countries, specifically maybe Central or Eastern Europeans, acquire rights. So I asked him, is that
the Constitution or the American Revolution?
Well, Giffin, I don't know.
I think there's a difference there, right?
Kind of both.
Okay.
So what I'm going to invoke here is a couple things. So to kind of get at the core of this, you can kind of say, Jordan, you mentioned geography, and it is true that there were a lot of geography problems that Europe would have because it was settled for so long. Well, settled for so long that the United States didn't really have, in a large part because a lot of the natives had already passed by the time Europeans arrived, and also in large part because of conflicts between the two that were won by Europeans.
And at the time, being landlocked was hugely different than being an ocean away.
That from what?
Like away from the people you're gaining independence from. Yeah.
That is that is the next point too. And this is something that there's a great comparison to the South American revolutions. Because in the United States, we were blessed with something called salutary neglect. You guys familiar with the term?
Yes.
Basically, 2 centuries of England not caring how the colonies run as long as they benefit in some way, commercially. And they wouldn't even enforce really some of the laws that they did have that were governing the colonies, in respect to commerce. I mean, I think you guys have heard, you've probably heard the idea that a lot of the early Americans were smugglers, basically. Like they were expert smugglers. And that's kind of as a result of the salutary neglect. And that's something that not even other American, and I say American in a Pan-American sense, not other American nations had. Because, so, of course, the other great power in the New World was Spain. And the Spanish instituted a very rigid system of viceroyalties in the New World. And so there was an enshrined... what are you laughing at?
I'm sorry, it's such a... Giffin is talking about like the philosophy of the basis of social revolution, and Adam just takes a hit from the base. Sorry, that the distinction there just got to me. I couldn't stop laughing.
Left side of my... But I don't think it was anything. There was something distinct about it. I think they were harmonious, actually. I think one fit the other perfectly.
I think I heard somewhere that George Washington vaped. I'm not entirely sure about that.
I think the wine fits more with the theme than the vape.
Well, I'm trying to quit. I know this is the quickest. Well, here's the thing.
Quit,
I mean,
quit wine or quit vaping?
Quit vaping. Okay, but here we can cut this section out because it's not entirely interesting. Yeah. But so I was hitting that Juul pod, right?
Okay.
Or I was hitting the Juul, I mean to say.
Okay.
And I was smoking like a pod and a half a day, which is equivalent to like a pack and a half of cigarettes.
20 packs.
No, it's not. It's a pack and a half of cigarettes a day.
Okay.
All right. Anyway, but it's still insane.
So cigarettes, Jordan, you might be thinking.
Oh yes, that's right, Giffin.
20 packs.
Oh, I'm sorry.
20 packs a day.
Sorry. No. Giffin was right.
Okay, but so this is like, it's gotten me down to, it's just like a friend's. I've been borrowing it just at night, but I've been smoking the equivalent of like, I don't know, a cigarette or two a night for the last week now. So I haven't bought any more Juul pods. So I'm trying to like wean myself off.
I'm happy for you, Adam. That's good. Good luck.
Too bad that there's so much smoke involved here. It's not very inconspicuous, but
I think it adds to the texture of the conversation.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Giffin. I couldn't keep that in.
I get it.
I'm sorry if I derailed you.
Humor is one of the rights, I think.
Adam's Republic, the right to vape.
Okay. If I can remember my point, we can get back to
I'm
it.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. So I was talking about one of the differences to kind of get at what fundamentally was different about the United States. A good source of comparison is the other nations in the New World, because you're right. One of the enormous factors is that England, which is the oppressive body in this case for the American Revolution, was an ocean away. There was no physical location here, but France didn't have that. The people of France, the Third Estate, did not have that luxury of having a king, an ocean away, doesn't really care. They didn't have salutary neglect for 2 centuries. They had a king who lived a life of luxury towering above them. And that is one interesting difference. But the New World, if you look at other countries, especially those which were Spanish territories, Spain had instituted a system of viceroyalties, which were basically relatively rigid government structures. Largely, the power here was enshrined not by those people who lived and were born in the New World, but rather the people who were from Spain, peninsulares, from the Iberian Peninsula. And that basically, the way the Spanish set up their colonies almost took away from the benefit the United States had of having an oppressive body an ocean away. So that's, I think, a good place to kind of imagine where American exceptionalism is valid.
Yeah. Maybe in its founding. I don't fully buy how the founding necessarily makes the United States that exceptional in its unique government now. I mean, well, so there were a few sort of oxymoronic statements in there, actually. But what I mean to say is that although its government structure may be just unique from other governments, I don't see why we necessarily can't I don't know, try to, I can't even think of the word right now because I drank too much wine, but regardless, why we can't just adopt, other very good aspects of other governments.
So Adam, can I make a point here?
Sure, go for it.
So the reason that I think that, so you're arguing that at its founding, yes, there were some exception, but really it's waned since then, right? That's kind of your general argument?
Yes, just due to the fact that I think there is a distinction between how the United States how our government was founded and how it's operated over the last 200 years.
So I think what ties
I think there's a
these
distinction
ideas,
there.
Yeah, so I think what ties the idea is the Constitution, which has, I think the United States was really kind of privileged almost in that it didn't really need to take, so the ideas that were enshrined here are, at the time were a little radical, right?
Sure.
But invoking the sense of radicalism is, for the United States, is a little bit different than it is in France. We had kind of like the salutary neglect left us without having to push radicalism too far. And because of that, I think that is what influenced the founding and probably had a large influence, on the Constitution and like the rights enshrined as compared to France, at which we, let's draw the comparison. But that has stayed with us. And so in a sense, whereas at the beginning it was a great benefit, I think there's an argument that the American exceptionalism of today is more of like an anchor.
So I guess anchor could be either a positive thing or a negative thing here.
I meant it in a negative sense, but I don't want to come off as like hating America.
I mean, but you could see it.
It's been done.
You could see it as
we'll cut this part out, right?
It grounds us in the sense that we're not going to go off the rails in any sort of quick way that would just destroy the country within a matter of a decade. However, it does hinder progress, and I've been saying this for the last few years, but I mean, our government was designed not to work well. It was designed not to work well. It was designed that, if any law was to be passed, that there would have to be overwhelming representation and approval. Oh, well, come on. Think about it. I mean,
I think you're well, one of the things that I'm imagining as you're saying this is the filibuster, which really only came into use like half a century ago. in the same way that it restricts legislation today.
I mean, what about the veto?
How can you forget
true.
I can't forget.
How can you deny the veto? I mean, I think I didn't
forget about it, but I'm not denying it either.
Okay. I'm just saying that there are so many checks and balances. No, well, I'm just saying there's so many checks and balances to our government that, I mean, I think it's fair to say that it's tough to get things through. It's tough to get through meaningful legislation.
Yeah. To this extent, we've been making I've been making a physical analogy, like the anchor. But another way to think about it is to think of it as a buffer, right? The Constitution buffers us from large swings, and this is also something that the people of Europe, and again, keep the comparison straight, France didn't have, because they had. Go ahead, Adam.
I was going to say, but I don't want to cut you off, but I was going to bring up I think a wonderful example of how just the limited scope of our government, where, how about under FDR, where
limited.
You got to hear out the argument first, though.
You're right.
Okay.
No. Giffin's rhetorical question is canceled your point.
No, please go on.
Just derail immediately. No, but I mean, consider the fact that once FDR took office, he began passing through these, all these things outside the purview of our Constitution, right?
The alphabet soup.
Of course. So we would agree to that. However, the Supreme Court, a year or two later began striking all these down one by one, saying these are unconstitutional. You may not do these things. Yeah. So, and then of course there was the whole midnight judges controversy, but that's outside the scope of the.
Yeah, no, I get your point.
But my point is that whenever you had a U.S. president come in and say, "Oh my God, we are in the worst economic state in our country's history. Let's do something about this." The Supreme Court, these men who were appointed by former conservative presidents were like, "Nope, you can't do anything. Sorry." I mean, I'm just saying that our government is designed to.
So does this go back to the argument that we were having before about how the rigidity can be a strength, maybe at its foundation, but a weakness as progress is made outside of it?
I think it is a strength in all. It has both strength and weaknesses in both of the cases, at the founding and as we have progressed as a society. And Adam's right. One of the things that these checks and balances, like the buffer or the ankle weight, whatever we're gonna use as an analogy, it does keep it seriously does keep us tethered to principles in a way that other leaders, if without these checks and balances, could easily kind of invoking some hysteria in the masses, could take power. And do things that even the people who have, might have supported this figure would not have agreed to, and would have become an oppressive force. Adam, you're absolutely right.
And I mean, although times are obviously changing in the sense that, the Supreme Court found Obamacare to be, legal, in fact, as a tax. That would not have happened 50, 60 years ago. I'm very confident in saying that, just given the makeup of our Supreme Court. So, I mean, I guess it depends who's in the Supreme Court. And I guess the Supreme
perhaps
Court,
too much.
Well, no, but here's the thing. I think the Supreme Court will reflect culture, however that problem is. The problem is that culture is already 50 years old at that point. It reflects a culture 50 years ago. So it's you know what I mean? So
Brett Kavanaugh's culture might be different entirely from...
Oh, no.
it was boofing.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
We just lost half our subscribers.
I actually wanted to go, what Giffin said seemed like a perfect pivot to a thing that I wanted to get to, which was the 6th article about the general will. So it said...
Yeah, how have we not gone there yet?
Yeah, well, I think we've been just talking about other interesting things, too. But
it's a huge thing.
Yeah, the thing you said before, I thought got to it. So let me read it for the audience. So the 6th article is, law is the expression of the general will, every citizen has a right to participate personally or through his representative in its foundation. It must be the same for all, whether it protects or punishes. All citizens, being equal in the eyes of the law, are equally eligible to all dignities and to all public positions and occupations, according to their abilities, and without distinction except that of their virtues and talents.
Jordan, we were having a conversation earlier about affirmative action. This would be the other probably main article that France would look to.
Yes. Well, so
the invocation of the general will. This is the phrase as it was used, general will, which is of course English, but in the French, the phrase is Rousseau's. Just to make it clear here.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, Rousseau coined the term general will, and this is what is invoked directly from Rousseau. And again, there's arguments that Rousseau, it was maybe used in a way that Rousseau might not have fully agreed with, but at the very least, as it was kind of imagined in the French populace, the idea of the general will is incredibly important here.
And yeah,
I was gonna say, okay.
Yeah.
Who's going here?
I wanted to make a quick remark that I found it interesting that almost all of the articles followed the same semantic or maybe deeper than that formulation, which is you start with a very broad and general statement and then kind of carve away at it, almost like a piece of wood, to a more refined article in the end. So it says, law is the expression of the general will, period. Very short statement. Then it adds that, citizens have the right to participate and, but also maybe not personally, but through his representative. And it must be the same for all, whether it protects or punishment. So that's it's defining it more. And then, all citizens are, they're equal in the eyes of the law. So it defines it a bit more. They're equally eligible to all of these specific things like public positions and occupations, but it's according to their abilities. And it's also without distinction except to their virtues and talents. So it's just like it takes like a round cylinder and then carves it down to like a very defined shape.
Round cylinder. Okay, so I think Article 6 might be the worst example of this, actually, because this stays pretty broad, although it does refine. Yeah. A lot of the other articles refine even more, specifically by invoking law or the general will. But since Article 6 kind of defines general will, it's actually one of the broadest. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
I just wanted to comment on the fact that, just sentences 1 and 2, I think. So you start off, law is the expression of the general will. You get a sense from that first sentence that, it's like, okay, they're speaking of a true democracy here, where the laws do truly reflect the will of the people. And then sentence 2 is every citizen has the right to participate personally or through his representative in its foundation, which I thought was not a contradiction, but somewhat of sort of undermines the first one in a sense, because I think the first one is possibly one of the truest statements and clearest statements of democracy in its most pure sense, while the second one is,
is it because of the clause or through his representative?
Or through his representative, where it's like it doesn't necessarily have to be of the general will at that point. You know what I mean? Because a representative can very much rule against or legislate against the general will. So it's maybe a small thing, but I thought that was interesting.
No,
where I was just taken aback by how clear that first sentence was. It was like, wow, this is very clear. And the second one's like, nope, just like the U.S. Okay.
yeah, you see this a lot. So the invocation of the general will can be viewed in a couple different lenses. One of which is some sort of true ideal of a democracy, right? A true representation of everyone, some sort of collective, right? Kind of goes beyond just the sum of its parts. General will. But at the same time, this has been kind of criticized as kind of the dictatorship of the proletariat, kind of like the worst aspects of the masses in a way. If that makes sense.
I wrote that as a note. I said, how does this safeguard against mass delusion?
Exactly.
Yes.
That's a good criticism. This is a very fair criticism.
Yeah, Adam. I mean, there's always just it's a tightrope balance. Honestly, I mean, it's like you look at the United States and you can clearly point to distinct laws in our books that just seem unjust to the vast majority of us. It's like, wait, why are we throwing people in prison for decades for smoking marijuana? Why are we doing that? And it's like, okay, we seem to collectively agree this doesn't seem to be the best course of action to address marijuana in this country, right? Throwing people in prison for decades.
Absolutely.
But then at the same time, the argument, like you just said, to the counter is, well, we don't legislate on behalf of what is popular, right? We elect representatives who legislate on what is they think is right, rather than what is popular. So, I mean,
and yet, I feel like, at least in the kind of general conscious of the United States, we do kind of espouse democracy as one of it, like a true ideal.
Sure.
But again, the clearly no one likes a true democracy, or else France and the United States would have framed it more direct.
Sure.
Well, I wonder, honestly, if is that more of a contingency of the technology of the age? Like, how could you actually have a true democracy when you don't have the internet?
Ballots?
For every single piece of legislation? I guess you could, yeah.
Oh, for every single piece of legislation, yeah, but it is... So, this is actually a very good point, because in the French Revolution, there was a time where, like, democracy was very much expanded, but within like a couple of weeks, you started to have turnouts for, like, because it was like so broad in its scope. You had turnouts that were like in the dozens rather than like the thousands you would expect. This is a very clear burden on the people to have to put in their sense on every single piece of legislation that is proposed.
Yeah, I think,
and also, I mean, there are just clear historical references, made by Thomas Jefferson. He's genuinely fearful of mobocracy, right?
Oh yeah.
So I mean, there is that element of it too, where it's just, well, once the masses are educated enough, then they get more of a say. But for now, it's just not conducive to a stable government to have everyone, for equal say.
Absolutely.
Well,
Go ahead, Jordan.
The one thing that I kind of wanted to draw like attention between was 6 and 4. It seems like these are sort of you can really easily imagine scenarios where 6 and 4 are put at odds. And I was curious, how is there something, like, I guess is more of a question for Giffin, like how would these be resolved? Is there something inherent to like the Declaration of Rights of Man in general that would resolve it? So, like, for instance, I wrote as an example, female genital mutilation in Saudi Arabia, for instance, is the general will. Like, the voting representative, not that Saudi Arabia votes, but in this context,
get what you mean.
The voting representative wants that to happen, but it is clearly is at odds with the first sentence of 4. Liberty consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one else. So
I don't know what Saudi Arabian law states. I highly doubt it draws to this extent from the Declaration of the Rights of Man.
I know that, but I mean, if that scenario were to happen in a society, based on the Declaration of Rights of Man.
Yeah, no, okay, I get your point. It's interesting that you tied it to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I guess I was just making the example too specific.
So you're talking about, and this is a very good point, is that there's internal conflict within this document. And there is internal conflict, you could argue, within the American document as well. But it seems, because of all the exceptions in this, in the Declaration of the Rights of Man, it's very much more clear where there's conflict. So, yeah, you're right. Liberty consists of doing anything which does not harm others. And then Article 6, the law is expression of the general will. So what if the general will is to allow people to do actions which harm others? That's a fundamental conflict. And the conflict is resolved either by the bureaucracy, like the government, the way it's been set up, just the natural forces, whether it's influenced by like corporations, or if like lobbying efforts by people, or by mass revolt. That's how it's resolved. There's internal conflict here that really can't be resolved in any other way than either the legislature or the judiciary, kind of for each individual point, explaining why one way works and the other way doesn't. There is inherent conflict here.
Well, the reason also why I asked that is because it is clear actually in the Declaration of Independence, because it says, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or the states, whatever, goes to the people. So it tells you where the default is, but I didn't see where the default was in the Declaration of Rights of Man.
That's a good point, actually. So the United States, are you talking about like the 9th and 10th Amendments?
Yeah, it's in the chart that you gave. It's in the comparison to the 6th article. So the 6th article
sounds like the 10th Amendment, right?
Yes.
Is that the 10th one?
The power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, or reserved to the people respectively, or to the states respectively, or to the people. So there is kind of an invocation of the states here.
Yes.
But you kind of
says,
were talking about or to the people, which is, again, I think I made a point to draw this comparison in the document. So I see what you're saying now. And you're right. There is kind of the 10th Amendment kind of does give a default referral that almost seems like it's invoking the general will.
Yeah.
And yet, I think the kind of cultural implications are different between the two. Because the general will is espoused so highly that I think in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen is espoused so highly that it has consequences. Because you could make a solid argument that the 10th Amendment basically is invoking the general will, when out, both as a foundation. Well, the 10th Amendment specifically invokes it as a default. But I think that you can make an argument that the document itself, in espousing democracy and freedom, kind of invokes the general will inherently.
It just doesn't do it in practice, though.
Yeah.
I mean, because the thing is, anything not legislated by by the states, the federal government is, the freedom, is given to the people. However, the states tend to legislate on everything. The federal government doesn't, right? So there's never really any laws or freedom that's been left up to you. The states will legislate on it.
So there's kind of the idea here that the more local, the more direct, so the kind of a states' rights argument, quite frankly, the more local it is, the more responsive to the people it is. I think that's kind of like what you're invoking, but you're right.
Follow Pennsylvania politics and you won't think that anymore. Most corrupt state in the United States. It's gotta be. Do you follow them?
Not particularly.
Dude, give me an example, Adam, and try to tie it to the Declaration of Rights of Man.
How about the fact that they wouldn't fund Pitt just like a few years ago?
Oh,
they were withholding money.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a ridiculous. Pretty much, they were kind of putting on a show.
A hostage, yeah. It was like a hostage scenario.
How about the fact that they continually raise taxes every single year to cover increasing road costs? Like, have you driven through Pennsylvania on those toll roads? And they continue to go up.
Like $30 to go to from Pittsburgh to Philly. Yeah.
The toll roads is a big issue.
It's kind of, but here's the thing. Like, those are just examples of Pennsylvania government. It just dive into it at some point. Like this state.
What's your larger point though with these examples?
Are you saying an example of not being responsive to the people?
Yes, that was in response to that. So the idea was, in principle, the Constitution is saying, okay, if the state doesn't have anything to say about it, or the federal government doesn't have anything to say about it, it's up to the people. But that's not true. The states will just fill in the gaps where the federal government is quiet. And
I think the interpretation is basically the people are represented through the state. Again, kind of like a states' right mentality. But we definitely don't. Well, both like socially, culturally, don't really invoke the general will in the same way. I think in certain instances, like the marijuana, which we mentioned earlier, convictions, we get a sense that like there's some injustice, like there's something wrong with our system, where a very solid majority of the people don't agree with his policy that is longstanding in the United States, and yet nothing has been done, or nothing is being done. So there's definitely conflict there. States maybe are not good vessels of the general will, and maybe that's because people don't really think of the general will in the United States in the same way that a Frenchman might be very well, familiarized with the idea of the general will.
True.
I honestly wonder if this is kind of meant to be like the ideas at the time or at least like the culture at the time, had a much smaller scale to it than ours does now.
Culture?
Yeah.
Are you talking about like the movement of information?
To you?
I'm not sure how to quantify culture.
Just like
we have a much richer culture now than people in the 1700s.
It's more complicated.
Just due to the fact that we just have much more leisure time. I think culture will fill leisure time. So
yeah, right? That, and also the sense of like, I mean, the three of us are talking, and we don't have to be geographically even near each other to do that, right?
Yeah, like, that's what I thought you were talking about, the movement of information and communication.
Yeah. So I wonder if these ideas are that the general will is, you can kind of have the general will percolate up through the system that contracts, right? So you kind of have like this pocket of people go to this representative, and then he represents them in the government, right? Like it narrows it down. I wonder if that was more valid in a time that people were more geographically connected than ideologically connected, I guess. Because like
so you're saying
it breaks down now. Yeah,
there's a lot of I see what you're saying. So back then, a group of people within like living within like a certain valley or around a certain city would generally have the same kind of sense of culture, whereas now you can not only do you get a sense of culture that expands broadly, but also and I'm not sure if we've invoked this yet, but you also can find it easy to find subcultures that you kind of stay sunk into, if that makes sense. And this is definitely an aspect of the culture that you didn't see as much back then, especially in the United States. Yeah. So I'll tell a quick story here to kind of, I hope, illustrate your point.
I'll allow it. Sorry, continue.
Rat.
Okay, so I'm going to tie this back to the French Revolution a little bit. So what had generally happened throughout history? Well, in France, like prior to the revolution, you had the government was kind of set up not in Paris, but kind of like in a separate place, right? And what happened was the representatives, when it came to like meeting and legislating, especially like like a meeting of the Estates General, people would come from like their geographical region, which would have a little bit of diversity within it, right? They would like go together because that's who they knew, to the general body, and they would sit with and communicate with and be with largely the people that they already knew, and there's like a little bit of, again, inherent diversity there, ideologically, on the political spectrum. But whenever the government moved to Paris, you have something that
you forgetting a part of the story?
What am I forgetting?
Sorry, I don't know what order you're telling it in. But then when the representatives would travel to the government, they would converse between each other and get a sense of like the more broad spectrum of the government.
That's not exactly the direction I was going.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, so whenever the government moved to Paris, and you no longer you could like kind of move there permanently instead of just kind of go there occasionally. What you had is people were not organizing by kind of their origins geographically, but by their ideologies. And this is kind of like a polarizing effect. Does that make sense? People would be with their like ideological spectrum, and it tended to push people to the extremes, because whereas a moderate, whenever you're coming from the same geographical area, would probably be relatively moderate by any like the national scale. But when all the people that you talk to are within like the ideological left or right, then the sense of moderation and like the kind of social forces pushing you to kind of accept the general kind of consensus, they aren't there the same way. And I think we see ties to this today with the kind of isolation you can find in subcultures on the internet. Mm-hmm. Am I coming through?
Yeah, no, I agree with you entirely. I don't know. It's just kind of, I guess, like musing about whether that degrades the idea of the general will at all.
I guess what that leads to is a more polarized population. The general will gets a little bit shakier, If you have 51% of people that, are centered on over here in the political spectrum, and then the other, 49% are over here, and like there's enormous conflict in ideology, can you really say you're invoking the general will if you go with the 1%? Whereas, especially if, again, this is what happens as a result of the polarization. If there's no polarizing forces as much, you kind of can get a more reasonable sense of a general will, a moderate position. But like the moderate position, if you have two polarized bodies, there's very few people who actually hold that value, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the middle point
instead of a bell curve.
Yeah, the middle point is like an average of the two rather than a combination of the two.
And it's very lowly populated.
Yes.
So the idea of the general will almost seems to not be plausible. Like there's in addition to the conflict within the Declaration of the Rights of Man itself, you have conflict kind of ideological if you think about the general will in a very polarized population. You kind of lose that sense of the general will. With a bell curve, you can kind of like, if you imagined a bell curve, you can kind of nod at a general, kind of consensus. But two polarized bodies with very few people in the middle, general will kind of loses its, force.
Some sort of bimodal distribution.
Exactly, bimodal distribution. That's exactly right, Adam.
Yeah. I don't really know where I was going with that, but it just seemed interesting to me.
It's very interesting.
Well, it's kind of like U.S. politics right now.
Yeah,
I mean, Trump's impeachment. I'm not saying let's dive into it. I'm just saying, you're either for it or against it. You're not kind of like, well, it's kind of like, I just feel like, how many people are actually going to get convinced either way at this point?
Yeah, I definitely feel polarization on this issue. Now, there's probably a couple people who just aren't that involved in politics and don't really. Sure. They could probably be swayed, but I definitely get the sense of the bimodal distribution. People who have like thought that the impeachment took too long, and people who think this is an absurd, an impeachment attempt. It's the inquiry itself is just absurd.
How could we impeach Jesus as representative?
Yeah. Like it
he
really
rules
is,
not through the people, but through God himself.
Yeah. No, it truly is kind of either or. I mean, because like the situation you put forward about someone who doesn't really follow politics, they're not really in the national conversation anyway. I mean,
and yet they can vote.
They will vote. I'm just saying, like
they might not.
But when talking about general will here, it's like I think there's generally you're talking about people who were in the national conversation. And
that's the thing, though. The general will kind of invokes everyone, not just like it's very like almost an elitist perspective that the general will is for the people who are involved. The most involved.
Yeah, but I
agree with you that the population should be educated.
No, but I'm just saying in practice it's generally true because I mean if you don't know what's going on, it's not that you can't vote; it's that you're less likely to vote. You're not someone who's you're not likely to be someone who's gonna, I guess, punish someone politically for ruling either way on the impeachment process. If you don't even know what's going on, if you have no opinion on it, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, so I don't know. It was weird. I don't know. Like we've definitely mentioned these terms a lot on this podcast. But like so there was it's a different variant of what we've been kind of saying all along. But there were a few specific examples I wanted to bring up. There's like in terms of how you look at the world ethically. There's a lot of like ways to look at it, but one system is called deontology, and it places the rights of the individual above anything else. And another one is called consequentialist, and that places the consequences of an action above any other considerations. And I thought that the Declaration of Independence had specific examples of notes that were much more deontological, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man had specific examples that were far more consequentialist. So
that's an amazing comparison, actually. I have not heard these terms really, but that's incredible that you bring this up.
They're two ideas or systems of ethics. The deontology was really systematized by Immanuel Kant, who I'm assuming you've heard of.
Yeah.
Kantian ethics is it's a specific form of it, but it basically places the right of the individual above any other considerations you may have, right? Like I said, and consequentialism places the consequences of an action above any other considerations that you may have. So if you look at, I saw these two in tension between the two documents in a few specific places. So if you look at on your comparison sheet, Article 8, for instance, it says, the law shall provide for such punishments only as are strictly and obviously necessary, and no one shall suffer punishment except it be legally inflicted in virtue of a law passed and promulgated before the commission of the offense. But to contrast that, in the Declaration of Independence, it says excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishment inflicted. Sorry, that's a Bill of Rights. But so do you see how there's like a difference between it sets up a right that cannot be superseded by consequences versus in the Declaration of Rights of Man, it provides a general framework. However, it's guided by the outcomes of that framework. There was
I can absolutely see that. Yeah.
Yeah, there was another one. Two down from that. Article 10 of the Declaration of Rights of Man says, "No one shall be disquieted on account of his opinions, including his religious views, comma, provided their manifestation, their consequences, in other words, does not disturb the public law established by order." But if you look at Declaration of Independence, Bill of Rights, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the right exercise thereof. Or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. And it does not provide a manifestation or a consequentialist caveat there.
That is amazing, actually, that you can, wrap this into the ethics, because I've never seen this in this framework before, but it is almost glaringly present. And yet, I'm going to bring something up here. I feel like out of a kind of a practical necessity almost, the United States has adopted a little bit of the mentality of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, because it does say, the Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of, prohibiting abridging the freedom of speech, right?
Yeah.
And yet, we know that there are certain things that we cannot say without consequence, right?
Yeah, you can't shout fire in a theater.
Exactly. That is the exact thing. And that almost infuses the interpretation of like these founding American documents with a little bit of the what is the ethics system? The consequentialism. Good Lord.
Yeah, the consequentialism. I just thought it was like I read all of this, and then it was like 2 hours later or whatever. I was like, wait a minute, that's like totally the divide between deontology and consequentialism.
That's amazing that you found this thread. That's amazing.
Which is it's interesting because I really don't know, and I guess I don't even know where you would look for this, but I wonder how, if that has manifested itself differently in other aspects of the two countries or even the two cultures. I don't know where you would look for that. Like, I don't even know what data would even be, but I thought it was just really interesting.
That is incredibly interesting. I'd be really curious to see, more
like
on this.
It would almost be like a kind of like a social survey almost. Like, I wonder if, to be honest, it just seems like without empirical evidence, it seems kind of true, right? Like, if you think about the American mentality, it privileges the right of the individual over the consequences of upholding that right. Like, it's almost like like would drive drive it into the ground kind of mentality, but you're not going to take me off the steering wheel, right? Versus the European kind of sense of pragmatic, well, let's just do what actually gets the job done.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is a great perspective to take on this, actually. And again, the consequences, you were talking about the consequences culturally. here. I think we definitely see those. I feel like in the United States, you would have a larger proportion of the population compared to other Western nations. In fact, maybe compared to any other Western nation. And, if you ask people like, should rights, like these inherent rights framed in the founding documents, be infringed for the common good, I feel like you would get way more people agreeing with that kind of libertarianism in the United States than you would in any other Western country. So that's kind of one of the consequences, I would say.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And even though I feel like we have kind of infused a little bit of consequentialism into our interpretation of the founding documents, again, the fire in a theater, which is a great example, we still have this inherent sense in America that isn't present elsewhere. Something American exceptionalism.
I wonder. I sort of almost wonder if this is a some sort of a balancing act, maybe on the part of the American system, where you could imagine that, most of the time, this deontological way of looking at the world actually provides pretty good consequences. But but say they didn't, say they just immiserated everyone, well, then I don't think the government would hold any of those leanings, right? So is it, I almost wonder if it's kind of, they're looking at it in just a weird scope almost. Do you kind of get what I'm just thinking through it.
I see some conflict in that, in the practicality versus the idealism in the United States. And again, there's internal conflicts within the other documents as well, like the Declaration of the Rights of Man. But I do see, if that's what you're getting at, this kind of conflict between the rights, which are, enshrined highly, and they're very pervasive in the United States beyond other Western nations, but also this kind of like most people would agree, even in the United States, that you gotta be lenient enough. You gotta have a loose construction of the Constitution enough to respond to very important social, events or injustices.
Yeah. That was just.
So we take in America, I would say we have. Remind me of these two ethics systems.
Deontology, which values rights, and consequentialism, which values consequences.
Okay, so it seems like the United States model is deontology with injections of consequentialism when needed. Just little splashes, and then, at least directly comparing it to France, they have a little bit more consequentialism.
Yeah, it's just, I don't know. I guess it's interesting because, like, it seemed to me as though in the Declaration of Rights of Man, they injected, like you said, rights, but because they would produce good consequences. Almost,
it was always viewed within a framework.
That
seemed limiting inherently.
Yeah, but I almost wonder if the Declaration of Independence has that that injection reversed, because they're injecting consequences into considerations of rights. I don't know, because it just seems like it's more it seems more contradictory in the Declaration of Independence than in the Declaration of Rights of Man. Do you know what I mean? Like you can, it seems more logical or more reasonable maybe to infuse the idea of rights to produce good consequences. But it doesn't seem as intuitive or reasonable to inject certain consequential exceptions to rights to ensure the rights more. Do you know what I mean?
I kind of get what you're going at, but I would have to think about it more within the framework.
Yeah, I don't know. It just seemed like it was more internally consistent the way that the Declaration of the Rights of Man had it set up.
I find myself kind of agreeing with you, except I keep reminding myself that there are inherent conflicts within the document itself. But you're right. Yeah. I think there is conflict, with beyond the in the relationship between the documents and like the government and the people. You definitely do see it's logically consistent from the founding document of France that you would make considerations of the public, one of your foundational kind of reasonings. But that is, even though we kind of do this in the United States, it is not as logically consistent. It doesn't logically follow from the founding document to ever impose anything that infringes on any right.
Yeah.
It is logically inconsistent.
Yeah.
Adam, do you have
I would have to think about that more.
No, I generally agree with what was said. I think a minor distinction would be, I think, in the French Declaration of, the rights of man and citizen. Yeah, I would say that I think it's less that they're giving rights because of the consequences of giving those rights, but more so they're giving rights with the consequences of those rights in mind. So it's like, okay, we're going to give you rights, but here are some caveats to them, right? Less so, but, than the direct, okay, we're only giving you rights because they're going to lead to good consequences. I think that maybe that state of mind I don't see as much in the document.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's not even falsifiable. Maybe like the answer to that is dead with the authors. I don't know.
Sure, that might be
invoking death of the author.
I think that might just be too cynical a reading of history. To say
I just don't know.
To say that what?
That these rights were given to them, to general citizens, simply because of the good consequences that will lead from them, not simply because they wanted to give rights to people and add, a consequentialist spin to them. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I can understand that.
I think it might be too cynical, but
yeah, I don't know
that's
if
fair. I think there were definitely idealists, in France.
Yeah.
I can say for certain that
product of the Enlightenment. So I don't know, but otherwise, yeah, I kind of agree that, even the exceptions to the limited exceptions to the Bill of Rights, they are contradictions. There is no room for, exemptions to the Bill of Rights. So
cool.
I feel like we have too much agreement here.
Well,
I mean, it's just true.
Where's Teddy?
Yeah. Well, I was gonna say we've been the recording time is at 1 hour and 40 minutes. Is there anything else we wanted to get to? I didn't realize we've been going for so long. It was a good discussion.
I wrote a couple things down. Let's see if I can find anything.
I'm mindful of our listeners' attention span and of my own bladder.
Okay.
And I drank too much wine too. Like I kind of shut down like 90% of that conversation. I was just like, I'll let them talk because I drank too much wine.
That if anything's a sign we should end, it's that.
Okay. That sounds good to me. I think we had a great discussion.
Yeah. What?
It's like, okay, giving me the inglorious end, but okay.
Oh,
I came back into the conversation. You're like, on that.
And now we're over.
Yeah, on Adam's drunken stupor, we're gonna end.
Even though I made a coherent point after.
It was coherent.
I wasn't saying it wasn't. It's just
I can make another observation if you'd prefer. End on a higher note.
Yeah, so Adam's not cranky with me. We'll get to do that.
Let Adam have the last word. I'll give you an easy one here.
Oh, well, thank you. I couldn't be more pleased.
No, in reality, this is like the only point that I had written down that was not brought up. Was kind of one of the kind of inherent, you could probably easily argue, flaws in both founding documents, both the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, Bill of Rights, as well as the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, is that if you notice, even the phrasing of like the titles of these documents, it was just men.
Yeah.
It was just men. The rights of man and citizen. And in France, this is the actual point that I'm gonna make. There was controversy as to what defined a citizen and is citizen just everyone who lives in the lives in there and the state, or is it like kind of restricted to like the the well-to-dos, maybe more than just the nobles, maybe more than just the two estates, but the urban poor, are they citizens? And what it came to was a discussion on what is called an active citizen and versus a passive citizen. And the active citizens would be able to, mostly vote, participate, in what was, an approximation of a democracy. Passive citizens, maybe they would enjoy some of the protections, but they didn't have the capacity to have their voice be heard. And it kind of this is like one of the arguments that was present, in the founding of the French Republic, that easily you can argue betrays the idea of the general will. It's the general will for me, but not for thee.
Yeah, it really does. It almost sets up like a I kind of like the distinction Adam was making between like the informed electorate and the uninformed.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the I'm going to tie this to American history a bit. Is one of the distinguishing factors between the active and passive citizen was whether there was property owned, and there was an argument at the foundation of the United States. And Adam, I hope you can corroborate this. That if you held property, you had a stake in the land, and therefore you would embody what was best for the nation.
Sure.
Yeah. So I guess you can tell me some thoughts on the positives and negatives of a system, which kind of not explicitly, or maybe explicitly, differentiates between different classes of people.
Well, I think for the time period, I don't think it was necessarily a bad thing, honestly. I mean, I think there's a reason most governments structured the citizenry like that. I mean, you can't have 50% of the, of any states voting on a subject they know nothing about. I mean, because even though people who are very ignorant now vote, you still have to get some form of education. And the thing is, let's say you live, I don't know, in the boondocks here in the United States, right? Right? Okay. You can still vote. But here's the thing. You will still come into contact with people that will give you, some semblance of the world. Unlike, let's say back in the 1700s, you were laboring 12 hours a day. And everyone around you knew nothing about the world. All you knew is that you had a certain amount of bread that you were going to get at the end of the week, and you had a certain amount you had to pay to the, whoever, the tenant of your land, and you were always going to have less money than the tenant was asking for. Those were the few things you knew about the world, right? So I don't know.
I wonder how much more the boondock worker knows, though.
Well, so to be fair, though, as I was saying that, I was like, well, that person might know about the same, yet they represent 0.00001% of the population now. Unlike maybe, I don't know, back in the 1700s, that might have been a strong 30-40% of the population knew nothing about the world. So
I wonder.
Yeah,
I don't know.
And
there's
in fact,
a lot of America
France,
that doesn't. Sorry, Giffin.
Well, I would be very hard to argue that the average American, even in very rural and isolated areas, know less or equal to a French peasant. And
I know.
Accurate information is here, but at the same time. So I guess what I was going to bring up was in France, an interesting aspect of American, another invocation of American exceptionalism, I guess, is that the capital of the United States, where legislation happens, is separated from, well, now there's a large city in Washington, D.C., but it was established originally, on a swamp, right? And this kind of was another degree of separation between the people and the government. And this is both positive and negative. It's a buffer in a good way, because I will invoke this. In Paris, the people of Paris sometimes, just like the angry rural or the angry urban poor, either because they don't have enough bread, there's bread riots, they could easily storm, the palace. And in fact, they chopped the king's head off. It's very interesting, the kind of recognizing that the general will fluctuates a little bit too much to be stable.
Yeah.
I think it's, yeah.
I would just make one more point. I mean, I think that I don't know. When I view like the average person in the United States, they might not know as much. However, I think that the average person in the United States is actually pretty well socially in tune with, I don't know, I would say so. I mean, what with
in tune to what?
I don't know, just
the general will.
21st century social culture. Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that, maybe a college educated person, but the average person, yeah, I think they represent someone in the 21st century, which is not a crazy statement because they live in the 21st century, but I'm just saying, like,
it's a tautology.
Sure. But I think it's just it's the truth, though. I mean, they have access to the internet. I mean, they are probably interacting with people, just maybe not around the world, but around maybe different states and stuff like that. It's I don't know. It's very different. You can't deny people, the right to vote in the same way that you could in the 1700s.
Yeah, absolutely. So. The rural poor in France in the 1700s had no connectivity. Whereas even someone who's the poorest place in America probably has a library they can go to and go to a chat room to talk with anyone they want.
Sure.
Or a smartphone.
Now, some people don't use it. Yeah, or a smartphone, exactly. Yeah. But some people don't use those, privileges, but they are there. That is absolute.
They are. That's a hopeful note to end on. Yep. And thanks to all of our listeners for watching this. If you got to this stage, let us know. I'd be interested to hear what people think about any points that we are talking about in this discussion. So comment below. But thanks for listening. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode of Plato's Cave. I always enjoy discussing topics with these two guys. So if you want to support the show in any way, you can do so simply by sharing it. I'm hoping to get this show out to more people. And so if you want to share it on Twitter or social media, that would really help me. You can also rate it on Apple Podcasts. Like this video if you're watching on YouTube, or subscribe via Apple Podcasts or an RSS feed. You can also discuss it on your own show and link back to my website, or you can connect me with recommended guests or topics to cover. You can get in contact with me at platoscavepodcast@gmail.com. Follow me on Twitter at Jordan_C_Myers. And I now have a website for my philosophy endeavors at jordanmyers.org. If you want to know a little bit more about me and my fellow co-hosts, as I said in the introduction, I'm a master's student in philosophy at the University of Houston. I did my undergrad at the University of Pittsburgh, where I studied mechanical engineering and philosophy. And now that I'm back at school, I'm hoping to more closely study moral responsibility, free will, ethics, epistemology, and moral psychology. Those are topics that I was introduced to and got really interested in my undergrad work. So Adam and Giffin accompanied me on this show, and Adam is one of my oldest friends. We actually met in kindergarten, and we've been interested in philosophical topics for as long as we can remember, and in a lot of ways it's been the basis of our friendship. Adam studied chemistry and biology at Cornell, and he is currently working at a law firm. And he's especially interested in moral responsibility as well, but also law, religion, and free will. Giffin is also one of my oldest friends, and we've been friends since elementary school as well. Giffin studied biology and economics at RPI, and now he works in human health research. He believes that there's very interesting overlap between both of his fields of study and philosophy, and he's particularly interested in exploring political philosophy. So this series was right up his alley. And with all of that information, again, I hope that you enjoyed this episode, and I hope that you get in contact with me or follow my work in any way that you deem reasonable to do. So with that, thank you for listening.